I'd just like to welcome you all to today. As you all know, I'm a bit of a nerd with realist methods and I do love, and I could talk all day about it. However, when you combine realist methods with mental health, then I get even more excited. And when you combine realist methods, mental health, and shared decision making in the context of antipsychotic prescribing, then I really do get quite excited because that is an overlap of all of my passionate areas. So this is the first time that someone that I have supported has presented through this network. I don't even, apart from the session that I did with Anna around interviewing, I don't think any of you have really had any introduction to the research that I've done, but I'm really, I don't know, is it weird to say that I'm proud of your research, Ita? Is that an okay thing to say? Because it's like your research, it's your PhD.
No, absolutely. It's ours.
Yeah, well, okay. It's always ours. I can tell you that. Everything I do is ours. It doesn't matter who I'm working with. I take ownership of everything. So I have a bio here for Ita, but I know Ita really well now because we've been working together for, I think it must be nearly 3 years now.
Yeah, I think so.
And we've moved on from this project to other things. So so that's always a bonus as well, and you can continue the relationships. But Ita is an advanced specialist pharmacist in mental health, and she works in Dublin in Ireland, not Southern Ireland as we would have called it, just Ireland. So that I think is a fall down of the northeast slang of Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. So Ita works both as a clinician and as a researcher, and her PhD focused on improving the management of antipsychotic induced weight gain, which coincidentally has been the focus of my research in the last 3.5, 4 years. And she is particularly interested in understanding how to effectively and systematically improve the management of antipsychotic related weight gain using pharmacological adjuncts. So for those out there who don't know what that means using other drugs. Interestingly, our research has looked at non-pharmacological perspectives. So together, it's been a really good, interesting perspective to learn about each other's areas. So Ita has published extensively in peer-reviewed Q1 psychiatric journals in the area of antipsychotic-induced weight gain management, and we have referenced her quite a lot in our papers. And she continues to pursue research in this area, and Ita's other research interests include implementation science methodologies to improve evidence-based prescribing within psychiatry. Ita is also a member of the Mental Health Pharmacy College and represents the Irish psychiatric pharmacy within several international groups, including the European Society of Clinical Pharmacy. Gosh, Ita, I don't think I knew all of those things about you. That's quite interesting to see them all written down. It's quite an accolade. And Ita's also going to be a mum soon.
I am in a few weeks. Isn't that scary? Gosh.
It's amazing. It's a good part of your life. It's a good time. So I think we've got whoever's going to turn up today. So shall I just hand over to you, Ita, for you to start with the presentation?
I think so. Yeah, I think we're good to get going. I'm going to be very rude just because Lauren is recording this. And first of all, just to double check, everyone can see my slides okay, or you can see the screen there? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop sharing turn off my camera just for the purposes of hopefully not distracting myself with my own face, and just because sometimes I'm up in the attic now, so my internet can be a little bit dodgy. So forgive my rudeness to do that. The other thing, as Joe said, is I am increasingly pregnant, and with that comes increasingly reduced lung capacity, so I can be a little bit breathless. So I'm going to take my time with this, but if anyone notices it, I'm not about to pass out. It's just an unfortunate side effect of my current situation, but hopefully we'll get through it together. Just first of all, so as Joe said, I'm Ita and I'm a pharmacist working in the Republic of Ireland, or Southern Ireland, as Joe would say. And thank you all so much for coming and being with us today. Oh, I think someone might still have their microphone on, if it's okay to turn that off. But today we're going to talk about the end part of my PhD project, which was on implementing shared decision-making in the context of antipsychotic prescribing. So as Joe said, I looked at, within my PhD, looking at improving the management of antipsychotic-induced weight gain. And for anyone who's not a psychiatric clinician, something that's really, really important is optimizing the antipsychotic that's prescribed to improve someone's cardiometabolic outcomes. So this actually wasn't This Realist review wasn't a planned part of my PhD initially, but ended up taking up a really significant part of it, really the last kind of probably 18 months, 2 years. And I think about 300 pages of my 700-page PhD thesis in the end. So I'm delighted that everyone would join and consider giving me their time today. So hopefully it will be useful for you guys. And with that, I will turn off my camera and we will jump in. Just one thing to say is that, you know, because I'm a pharmacist and a clinician that's relatively new to this area, we have made it very much that it's relevant to people who are kind of new to this area. Also, the rationale kind of being is that tends to be the most practically useful information. There are lots of books around realist methodologies and people who can communicate their results or the theory around that a lot more effectively probably than I can. So really what Joe and I wanted to do today was to talk about the messiness, I suppose, of completing a realist review often and the solutions that we came up with. That really helped us, I suppose, in publishing this review and getting good uptake with it. So with that, we will jump in. But if people do have questions, we have tried to incorporate time at the end to discuss those. So please do put them in the chat. I've left my contact details at the end. More than happy to help or advise in any way that I can, because as you'll see, this review is huge and very messy, but hopefully we put it together in a coherent way, but you can be the judge of that by the end of this presentation. So in terms of what I'm hoping that we get through today, there might be some psychiatric clinicians who choose to join, which everyone is welcome. That's wonderful. But as I said, we are focusing, I suppose, because we're on the Realist Hub, on the methodological aspects of the review. I will go into the background of shared decision-making in the context of antipsychotic prescribing and psychosis management, really just as a pitch for the project, but also one of the important take-home points that I want people to bring with them is around understanding your why. So why a realist approach was necessary in this case, because there had been lots of different evidence synthesis attempts in this. And that was really important when we wanted to engage with different stakeholder groups, which informed many parts of our review, as you'll see. But also, as you'll see, we published this review as a two-part review, which takes up a lot of journal space. And we had to be really, really clear on the why and the novelty of our review in order to engage the people that we needed to publish it in that form. Obviously, you hope that your work is novel and meaningful in and of itself, but if it doesn't get to the people who need to read it, that's a problem. So we'll go through the novelty of realist review methodology in the context of shared decision-making briefly. We are planning next year with our Mental Health Innovation and Improvement Network, which Joe runs and I help coordinate, a talk on the results of our review. So I'll give some information in the next slide as to how you can keep up to date with that if people do want to join, where there'll be a heavier focus on presenting the results. As I said, we're going to focus on navigating messiness and the complexity of our review within this talk and really the problems that we came up against. The first being, as I said, communicating the need for realist research. So implementation science methodologies in psychiatry are still quite novel. And as people who are getting to grips with realist methodologies will understand, they're quite complex to get your head around and also to communicate what they do, what they're composed of, etc. So we'll go through some ways that actually we managed to get engagement. We managed to explain to people why a realist review approach or this novel approach was needed as an evidence synthesis approach, and some solutions we came up around clearly communicating the benefit of realist methodologies in this area. We went through many rounds of focusing our research question and the focus of the review overall. And we're going to look at how we did that, how we came about needing to do that, and what actually the final review looked like compared to what was in the protocol. We ended up with 10 program theories in the end, which was quite different actually to, I suppose, when I had done my formal training. So I did the training in Oxford, very much feeling like I would have this neat program theory explaining how a shared decision-making intervention worked, and then I would package that up as one theory and I'd be able to present it, never mind having 10 at the end. So we're going to go through how we ended up with 10, how we grouped those together in terms of different frameworks that we used, and ultimately how we presented those again so that the important stakeholder groups, including patients, clinicians, policymakers, would be able to understand the complex nature of our results quite easily, and that we will be able to communicate what needed to be done actually to systematically increase the application of shared decision making within the contexts that we were studying. So with that in mind, as I said, the Mental Health Improvement and Innovation Network is something that Joe mainly looks after, and I probably just take some credit for, but don't do nearly as much as I should. But this is a network that we have, and that we advertise mental health talks, and we will hopefully at the start of next year, just for anyone who's joining who's particularly interested in kind of going into the depth of the results from this review, please do sign up to the JISC mail. This is also the LinkedIn group to stay abreast of what's going on. And as things go, we will advertise future talks around this area. So please do join that and keep in touch with things that we're doing in this area. I always like to begin with the end in mind, and because I'm a waffler, sometimes I can not be clear on what I want to get through to people. So I always like to start with my take-home points. So the first thing I've said already is know your why when it comes to realist methodology and the addition that it's going to add. Particularly, as I said, in this area, there had been many qualitative and quantitative systematic reviews using kind of traditional aggregative style methodologies before us. So knowing the novelty of our review, what it was going to add, what remaining research questions it was going to address that couldn't be addressed through other methods, was really important when we wanted to get people to join our stakeholder groups, when we wanted to publish our results, when we wanted to engage with the psychiatric community, which again, implementation science methodologies are novel. So that was really, really important, and it was well worth the investment of time. And that's why I put that here. As you'll see, particularly when it came to focusing our review question and changing a lot to what we had originally outlined in our protocol, to be blunt, was influenced by early and continuous engagement with stakeholder groups. So we had a clinician stakeholder group and a lived experience stakeholder group. And the lived experience stakeholder group was made up of people with a history of psychosis, with a history of schizophrenia, and psychosis in the context of other illnesses too, family members, carers, and then we had that separate clinician group. Now that was primarily made up of clinicians. Now they, excuse me, functioned or worked internationally, but we also had some policymakers there and people who were involved in designing that top-down typical structure of mental health services, and hopefully you'll see why that's important in the coming slides. So getting the proper members on that group and engaging are the people that you need. And
Ita, your mic's just gone on to
sorry, I think someone probably pressed mute all. Anyways, I'm back. Or you can hear me okay?
Absolutely fine.
Super. So yes, getting those key members that you need on that group and engaging with them early and continuously was so important for our review, in terms of making sure that the results that we had were the most meaningful that they could be for our practice and for people living with psychosis and actually implementing shared decision making. So I can't emphasize that enough. The third point is focus. And this is something, especially, and maybe it's a side effect of doing a PhD, you know, you want it to be as novel as possible. You want it to be as meaningful, to contribute something to the area. But the nature of realist reviews is that they are quite complex. They can grow legs quite quickly. And this is something I think really working with Joe helped me to actually narrow my focus so that it wasn't overwhelming, particularly in the context of a PhD, but especially when we got to publication stage, or actually putting those results together, so that I had a coherent and meaningful theory or program theory to contribute that people could also read and comprehend. Because particularly in the context of shared decision making within psychosis management, which is inherently complex, then we use a complex novel methodology which is new to the area. And then I added in, particularly within our context, decisions which can be politically fraught, results which were contentious at times. Actually having something that's coherent, that's evidence-based, that's quick to the point was so important. So taking my review from protocol stage to focusing it down to having a very clear, specific research question was so important, and something we spent a lot of time doing. And I remember at the time maybe feeling like a little frustrated that I wanted to move forward, I wanted to get started, I wanted to produce something, but actually in hindsight, it was so important. Quality is very important, and we'll talk about today some of the ways that we thought about the quality of the individual documents in terms of filtering the amount that we were going to put in, but also the quality of that overall program theory. And that helped, again, with the volume of data not becoming overwhelming by thinking anytime we wanted to add in something that was potentially relevant, actually did it contribute meaningfully to some aspect of the program theory or theories that we were developing, was really, really important. And for those people who are PhD students and who are hoping to publish their reviews, actually this was something that came up when our protocol was peer reviewed, being asked how we were going to quality assess the individual data documents, as well as actually assessing quality at the level of the program theory. And we'll discuss both of the methods that we use today for that, but it was something I was asked about in my Viva a lot as well, in terms of making sure that the theory that we were building was quality informed and it was evidence-based. So again, considering that from the earliest viewpoint is really important. So I've put up on the next, this slide and the next slide, a QR code. Now I think Lauren is going to very generously put in the chat the links to the papers. So we published this study, which is our SHAPE study, as part 1 and part 2 in Schizophrenia Bulletin earlier this year, so within the summer. And we'll go through how we divided our results, but essentially part 1 of our review looked at the first 5 of our 10 program theories. And that looked at what we call structural and contextual factors and their influence on prescriber behaviors in the context of implementing shared decision making. So these are very much factors that exist at an institutional or an organizational level, which are outside the influence of local clinicians, but very much influence their practice. So that was in part 1. So people can scan that code, or Lauren's going to put that into the chat, I think. And then in the second case, or the case of the second paper and the second set of 5 program theories, we looked actually at local intervention. So if you have the contextual and structural factors right, or you've addressed what needs to be addressed, if we want to implement interventions in the context of local consultation, so consultation perhaps with me as a prescribing pharmacist or as a consultant psychiatrist, for example, and a patient, what would you need from those interventions in order to implement shared decision making? So these are more what we call meso or micro level factors. So these are factors at the level of influence of local services or local clinicians. And that was how we chose to divide that up. But we'll go through the kind of theory or the framework behind that in the coming slides in case it's useful for other people's results too. So those 2 papers, as I said, are published open access, so they should be available there if people do want to look at the methodologies that we used, and some of the frameworks and structures are referenced in those papers too. So as I said, I'll just go briefly into the background of shared decision-making and psychosis management for those who are new. So essentially, when it comes to prescribing antipsychotics in the context of psychosis management, really all international guidelines within psychosis management for people who are not deemed treatment resistant, which is the majority, would say that it should be patient preferences that inform the choice of antipsychotic. So because of this, and because the most clinically significant differences between antipsychotics are in their side effect profiles rather than in meaningful differences between average efficacy estimates, these types of decisions lend themselves very well to shared decision making. And what is shared decision making? So it's a process whereby clinicians and patients collaborate to make treatment decisions based on clinical evidence and patients' informed preferences. So again, because it's a preference that's informing, or should at least be informing, the choice, these of course lend themselves quite well to shared decision making. Now, unfortunately, despite the fact that shared decision making features heavily in international mental health policy, best practice guidance, it isn't implemented anywhere near as much as it should be, particularly within the context of psychosis management and particularly within decisions that impact antipsychotic treatments. And you can see this in many different ways, or this disconnect between policy and practice can be seen in many different ways. One way is if you look at international trends of antipsychotic prescribing, and in this slide I've just given an overview of a graph produced last year, and it looks at international antipsychotic prescribing trends in the UK in the context of SMI, or severe mental illness management more generally, but also typically will include people with schizophrenia or psychosis in the context of other mental illnesses. But they looked at the trends of antipsychotics over a 20-year period, and what you can see is a predominance of prescribing of a small number of antipsychotics, particularly olanzapine, delineated by this line at the top. What we would expect if shared decision-making was routinely being implemented in practice is a much more diverse profile of antipsychotic prescribing, rather than this kind of predominance of prescribing of a small number of antipsychotics, particularly those with a sedative burden, which clinicians in many different contexts tend to favor, and patients not so much. But we also know that shared decision-making isn't implemented anywhere near as routinely as patients and as their families want it to be by qualitative research that's been done in this area. Selfishly, I've put some of my own qualitative work in this slide, and this comes from some work I did during my PhD, which asked people about their preferences for managing antipsychotic-induced weight gain, one part of which, as I said, is optimizing the antipsychotic that's prescribed, or making sure that a person is aware of the risks of continued treatment with a specific treatment, and that there are alternatives available, which is of course a shared decision. And what you can see is that in many contexts, in many different settings, in many different circumstances, people didn't even know that there were alternatives to the antipsychotics that they were prescribed. And that's worrying when you think about now, and particularly more than ever, there's probably upwards of 15 to 20 different antipsychotics available. And again, most of them with similar efficacy estimates, but very diverse side effect profiles. So people are often tolerating side effects that they don't necessarily want to, or that wouldn't come with, on average, another antipsychotic, but they don't know that those options are available for them. So how to increase the application of shared decision-making within antipsychotic prescribing is very much an international priority within research, and something that's relevant to people living with psychosis, to their family members, to carers, but also to clinicians and policymakers as well, if we are to adhere to best practice in this area, or if we are to really care about implementing person-centered care within our settings. And there has been much, as you can see in this slide, primary and subsequent secondary research or evidence synthesis projects in this area. In this slide, we give an overview of a Cochrane review that was published in 2022 that looked at about 15 different randomized control trials that looked at, in general, the implementation of shared decision-making interventions within mental illness, and asked whether or not any of them on average were effective. And for our purposes, or for the purposes of today, their conclusions were very much what you see when we try and flatten down these complex, multifaceted interventions into an average measure of effect sizes, that some of them work some of the time in some contexts, but we don't really understand why. So at the end of that review and other similar quantitative and qualitative, or these aggregative type reviews, we're left with the same remaining unanswered research questions. And that is, or they are, some interventions work, some don't. Why? We don't understand. So in the context of those complex behavior change interventions, what intervention strategies are responsible for effectively causing those outcomes associated with shared decision-making that we want, or causing prescribers to engage in key behaviors, or patients to engage in key behaviors associated with shared decision-making? We don't know what intervention strategies, or we didn't know what intervention strategies were responsible for those. And even in the case of efficacious interventions, none of them are really used in practice, and certainly not in a systematic way. So the recommendations often that exist around implementing shared decision-making, or these different types of tools, are they evidence-based or not, is the question. And these were the things that needed to be answered within our setting. Oh, sorry. Oh, did that just stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, your slides just disappeared.
Oh, sorry, I must have pressed a little bit. Share. Okay, are we back in business?
Yeah, back with research questions.
Thank you. So sorry, I'm just going to move back one slide there. So this brings us to the first problem to be managed, which is essentially how did we communicate that a different approach to doing research was now needed, and to answer those remaining questions and very much complement available qualitative and those kind of more quantitative or Cochrane style aggregative reviews and their findings. So within our review, we put forward a strong case as to why a different approach was needed and why it should actually be a realist approach to addressing these. And our two kind of primary arguments were based on A, the types of remaining research questions in this area were how and why interventions work and in what context. Such research questions can't be answered by those typical aggregative style reviews that are flattening these interventions down into an average measure of efficacy. So we needed a different approach, one that could account for intervention complexity and account for context also. Secondly, we needed to differentiate between studying simple interventions and appropriate research methodology to do that, and complex interventions. So complex interventions, of which behavior change interventions are one, and of which shared decision-making interventions are one type of behavior change interventions. The success of those are socially contingent. So that's different to something like a drug treatment, where we expect for everyone that it will function, or we wanted to indeed, to the same extent over time and across people also. In the case of something like a behavior change intervention, most people will intuitively appreciate that those interventions will work better in some contexts, some of the time for some people. So we needed a methodology that allowed us to understand why those interventions work and in what contexts. And for people now who are familiar with realist data analysis, they will know actually that realist methodology provides us with a methodology of understanding the links between context and outcome by basically making those mechanisms responsible for the outcomes that we're interested in measuring explicit, that they're testable, and that they're linked to context too. So in our circumstances, we very much pitched that if we could understand the mechanisms which are responsible for key behaviors associated with shared decision making, that we would be able to build context and associated intervention strategies into these interventions so that those mechanisms would be triggered and that we would be more likely to get the outcomes that we want. So we very much were focused on understanding effective intervention strategies and also those implementation contexts. So making those explicit so that we can understand how and why interventions work and in what contexts. And getting that clear, or pitching that appropriately as to why we needed a different approach to synthesizing evidence, was really, really important, as I said, at the point of engaging stakeholders, of getting support for our project, and at publication stage too. So the research questions that you'll see in both of those papers that we finally published, that we came up with, we put together two. And these are quite different to the aim that we had initially specified in our protocol. And in the coming slides, we're going to go through how that happened, or how we came essentially to these research questions. But the first was within antipsychotic treatment decisions. And again, in the context of psychosis management, because that's quite a unique contextual circumstance, what are the impacts of structural and contextual factors on prescriber engagement and shared decision making? Now, I've highlighted prescriber engagement here because it's one aspect that we focused a review from what was in the original protocol, and that is we focused on what prescribers need to engage in shared decision making, not patients or family members. And that was a difficult decision at times, and one where we had to do a lot of engagement with our stakeholder groups. But we'll go through that in the coming slides as to how we came up with that, or how we decided to do that. And the second part of our research question was, how do these interventions implemented within local contexts work, and what intervention strategies are likely responsible for effective interventions? So as I said, we did publish our protocol, which as a tip, it's a worthwhile endeavor to do, because it saved us a lot of space, despite the fact that we had a two-part review at publication, because we had laid out our protocol quite clearly. We could refer to that a lot of the time, and it saved us space when it came to publication, which I think, from speaking with others doing research using realist methodologies, it's something we can come up against with regards to the space within journals to talk about our program theories and the data sources which went into that. So if you do have time to publish your protocol, it is well worth doing. But the purpose of this slide is really to show that our aim was quite different to the final, the aim and the associated research question was quite different to actually the finalized research question, or our focused research question within the final review that we conducted. And that came from a number of different sources, or why we did that came from a number of different sources. So within our review, we followed Paulson's 5-stage methodology and moved through that in a typical nonlinear fashion, as you would. Now, this slide just gives an overview of the project flow diagram, which is adapted actually from Claire Duddy's review. So this isn't ours, but it is something that we adhered to and that was useful in communicating exactly what it was that we were doing. But what I want to highlight is step 1, which of course is the first step that everyone takes in conducting a realist review, which is clarifying your focus and locating those initial program theories to be tested. So this actually is what our initial program theory looked like, which, as you can see, does not contain any context, mechanism, outcome configurations, looks nothing like really a program theory in terms of explaining the intervention contents and how we actually got to the final outcome or how these interventions work. But it was useful for us as a research team in getting our head around how we were going to focus this review or what it was going to look like. I won't go through all of it because, as you can see, it's messy, and I don't actually think we included it wasn't in our final publication or anything like that. But I think it's useful for people who are new to this area to see how the review evolves or how you kind of initially come up with your program theory. So for us, what we did as a research team, and based on some exploratory literature searches, was lay out what we thought what patients would need and what prescribers would need to engage in shared decision-making interventions and the impacts of the contexts in which they're implemented in. So that is typically what mental health service delivery looks like when we're providing someone with psychosis management and prescribing antipsychotics within these contexts. So as you can see from the start, it's taking you all the way from the perspective of either a prescriber or a patient down to this final common outcome, which is a collaborative agreement regarding antipsychotic treatment. So it was this actual initial program theory that we presented to our clinician stakeholder group and our lived experience stakeholder group to say, this is kind of what we're thinking. What are we missing? Where should we go from this? And what became really apparent really quickly was that from the perspective of patients and prescribers, it was very clear that it was very different what they needed to engage with shared decision-making interventions and from local contexts compared to what patients needed. So to give you an example, patients spoke very much about information sources. So for example, who gave them information, how it was given to them, at what stage it was given to them, how many times information on different antipsychotics was given to them, compared to prescribers who very much spoke about these larger structural and contextual factors. So for example, the impact of mental health legislation, prescribers often feeling like their hands were tied behind their back when it came to increasing autonomy within decision-making among people who had psychosis. Would the wider public judge them if they prescribed an antipsychotic that they intuitively felt was less effective, but that a patient wanted, for example, because it aligned better with their side effect profile, and something went wrong, or in the unlikely event that harm came to someone, how would they defend themselves in that context? Do they feel like they can move away from prescribing or the over-prescribing of sedative kind of antipsychotics? And actually what helps them to engage in shared decision-making was very, very different to what patients needed. So with that in mind, we came back together, as a research team and decided that we needed to focus our research question. It was possible that we could have looked at what patients and prescribers needed, but it was way outside the scope of our review to look at both. And that was a difficult decision, I think, to decide on focusing on whether or not we would look at patients or clinicians' views, because of course, neither is more important, but we did need to ask the pragmatic question of, in reality, who holds more power to make shared decision-making a reality, and where are the research gaps? And with that, to ensure that our research results offered clear potential to inform intervention development, but also to direct policy and make a meaningful difference to the lives of people with psychosis within our setting. So we ultimately decided with our stakeholder groups and within our research groups to focus only on what prescribers needed. And this is because that's a big gap. Prescribers often described, or clinicians described in the stakeholder group meetings, not feeling listened to or not feeling like their needs were addressed, or that shared decision making was very much almost a buzzword that was thrown around in the context of policy, but particularly within psychosis management, not something that they had the psychological freedom to be able to do, and that very much disadvantaged patients. So to study what prescribers needed from interventions and from context, and to make that explicit and to put that together in a coherent evidence-based theory, or theories in our case, was actually really important to address that gap, but again, to make a meaningful difference in the lives of patients. So that was how we came up with the idea to focus our review on how it looked very different to what was outlined in our protocol. This engagement with stakeholders quite early in the process and making that really explicit was also very important to recognize that we needed to deconstruct shared decision making further. So this is an example of one shared decision making intervention which has been studied within randomized control trials. This is a group in Germany that's done a lot of work in this area, but this is one complex intervention which is called an SDM+. And how they measure the efficacy of their interventions is usually with something like the SDM-Q9, which you can see down here, which is essentially a questionnaire that asks patients whether or not they perceived that they were involved in shared decision making. But something that was really important with engagement, particularly with clinicians early in the process, was this focus on behaviors. So if I can show you the next messy slide, and this never actually went anywhere either apart from informing our research group meetings, but was still very important. We had to think a lot about actually, if someone is to engage in shared decision making, or if a prescriber is to be judged sufficiently to be engaging in shared decision making, what does that look like? What is shared decision making? What would they need to be demonstrating or engaging in? And essentially, you can see we tried to attempt this with these outcomes in the middle. But essentially the point that we were trying to get at, or when we were figuring out how we were going to design our literature searches to pull together all the literature in this area, we needed to more clearly delineate, again, compared to what was in our protocol that just talked about things like evidence of implementing shared decision-making, evidence, of questionnaire, patients feeling involved, etc. What is it that the prescriber would need to do? And particularly in the context of psychosis management, and antipsychotic prescribing, they would need to adopt certain behaviors, but they also would need to stop engaging in certain behaviors. And this is things like clinician-led decision-making, paternalistic decision-making, coercion, etc., for example. And that was really, really important when it came to actually bringing in an awful lot of literature that hadn't been considered before in the context of shared decision-making, but was so, so important in terms of influences on their behavior. So if I can demonstrate this perhaps a little bit more clearly on the next slide. There are certain things that a prescriber, as I said, would have to do and would have to stop doing. But spending the time actually further delineating what those outcomes are and further focusing that compared to what we thought initially was so, so important, as I said, in bringing in that range of literature. And literature that hadn't been considered within previous systematic reviews because of the nature of the methodology and because of the confines on that, which Realist methodology opened the doors essentially for allowing us to do that. But essentially prescribers would need to, if they were seen to be engaging in shared decision making, shared decision and responsibility, of course, consider you as a person, if you have a history of psychosis, as a valid partner in decision making, that your preferences are valid, that you have appropriate capacity, that you can be an autonomous decision maker, and really, really importantly, and this is something again we hadn't considered in our protocol, but be willing to engage in positive risk taking, and we'll go through what that is in the next slide. And really importantly, as I said, and something we hadn't considered initially, is what is it that they would need to stop doing? And this is to reduce paternalistic decision making and decreased risk aversion as well, which was really, really important. And again, if we hadn't engaged with our stakeholders early in the review, if we hadn't tried to clearly focus what it was we were trying to do and understand, we actually would just have ended up with another evidence synthesis project, including most of the evidence sources that had previously been considered, particularly in the context of qualitative evidence synthesis. And we really, really would have missed that evidence base that we needed to focus on context. So in many cases, prescribers enter the decision or enter the consultation with a person who is experiencing psychosis, and particularly in the context of antipsychotic prescribing, that I will make the decision here, that you are not a capable person of, or you are not capable in this case of making any or inputting to any extent into your decision making, which of course in some contexts is correct at that time. But that doesn't, just because a person can't say whether or not that they have any capacity to consent to treatment at all, doesn't mean that they wouldn't be able to tell you their preferences for side effects or that someone else wouldn't. But it means that a lot of the time clinicians were entering into consultations with the decision not to engage in shared decision making already made. And sometimes that related to capacity issues, and sometimes that related to other things like how it would be viewed externally, for example, or this promotion of risk-averse cultures, which we see so predominantly in psychiatry. But again, if we didn't break down into what it was, what outcomes we were interested in explaining in our program theory, we would have missed all of this. And this took quite a lot of time. And again, I remember feeling like, oh, I need to get moving, frustrated, but it was so worth doing and really contributed to the size of our review, but also its novelty and its contribution to psychiatry and shared decision-making research. So this gives you an example of two evidence sources that we were able to include. So our subsequent literature searches included search strings for shared decision-making, but they also included several search strings for risk aversion, for patient preferences, for all those outcomes that we were interested in building program theories explaining. We were able to design specific literature searches, and because of the realist methodology, able to bring those in to form a more coherent, evidence-based and informative set of program theories. But this gives you two examples of research that wouldn't traditionally have been considered, as I said, in any way within an evidence synthesis project looking at shared decision making. And these are two documents which were really important, but they were around positive risk taking and decreasing risk aversion. So what is positive risk taking for those who don't work in psychiatry? Essentially, it's risk management which improves a patient's quality of life, their plans for recovery, while remaining aware of the person's safety, their needs, their care, and the public. So we included this one document, which is Simon Wesley's document, which I think was commissioned by the UK government, which looked at modernising the Mental Health Act, which was a huge document, but it was a source of grey literature that we identified that told us a lot about what was happening in the ground or on the ground in the UK in terms of clinicians providing psychiatric care and the extent of risk aversion and the impacts on their behaviours, particularly with regard to mental health legislation. So despite the fact that mental health legislation very much is supposed to be there to protect the autonomy of patients, it very much actually the prescribers feeling like it tied their hands behind their back with regards to being risk averse, or that they would be personally blamed if any adverse outcomes came about as a result of engaging in positive risk taking. And this second document here was one which actually was conducted in Wales by social care professionals, which looked at, again, different determinants of context of what actually increased clinicians' engagement in positive risk taking behaviours. So again, this change in our focus was really, really important to contribute to the novelty of our review. As our review was actually focused on understanding behaviours, and those kind of composite behaviours within shared decision making as a construct, that change in focus also allowed us to bring in substantive theory or formal theory to help strengthen our context mechanism, outcome configurations, and the quality of our final program theory. So because again we were focusing on behaviours, we looked at we used Susan Michie's COM-B model of behaviour, which was really, really important, and something when we got to peer review that they actually commented on was positive in terms of lending or taking theory from other areas that's known and thinking about how actually that can help us understand or strengthen the quality of our context mechanism outcome configuration. So for people, I suppose, who are new to the COM-B model, essentially it proposes that to engage in a behaviour, a person must feel both physically and psychologically capable, or C, and have the social and physical opportunity, which is the O, to exhibit the behaviour, and the want or need to demonstrate that behaviour more than competing behaviours at that moment. And it's the fact that capability and opportunity within this theory are seen as influencing the relationship between motivation and behaviour rather than motivation itself. And really, this represents the idea that at any individual and any individual moment, actually, essentially, they act as kind of a logic gates in terms of the impact that motivation has on behaviour. So this is, I think, a formal theory which is used quite a lot in the context of realist methodology, but it really did help and was something that was positively received by those who were critically appraising our review at the end. I've included this if there are PhD students or people who are new to competing Realist reviews is that these or this paper by Sheeran and al. Actually contains a couple of different criteria, which I found useful in deciding what formal theory that we would use to inform our data analysis process when we were deciding on a substantive theory that we would use. And this is kind of considered general best practice to try and lend from established theories in the area, and kind of filled gaps when we weren't or didn't have the extent of the evidence base that we needed to understand perhaps what was the context or what was the underlying mechanism responsible for the outcome that we were observing. The next thing that I wanted to cover in terms of complexity or managing the messiness of a realist review is because, again, this focus on many different behaviors as outcomes and not just one outcome, we obviously ended up with handling quite a large volume of results. And I would have said at the start about working with Joe a lot to consider about how we were going to focus our review so that it was manageable, but also key interpretable by the range of different stakeholders that we wanted to engage with our results. So initially from our searches, we had 106 different data sources, which as you can imagine is quite large, particularly when these are not 106 results of randomized controlled trials. These were government documents, lots of grey literature, which was extensive. So we needed to think of a way to filter these. So we used Joe's method, which is outlined in this paper here, which I have included, which is essentially where we were assigned to individual data sources a global rating based on relevance, richness, and rigor, which is, I know, informed by other people's work in the area too. But this is one way that actually helped us kind of filter down our results initially. So only documents which were judged to have that sufficient rigor so that they were considered trustworthiness, but also were relevant and rich data sources, did we use to contribute to our final program theory. So only 4 and 5-star documents, with obviously 5-star documents being the most trustworthy and also being the richest sources of information too. So that was one way that we filtered it down, and that got us to about 72 in the end, contributing to our 10 program theories. What we then did with those 72 documents was actually, and Joe, this probably gives you PTSD, this one in the next slide, but actually was to try and put our information sources into these wider kind of conceptual buckets. And this was something, again, that helped me not feel overwhelmed by the volume of information that was there, and try to make sense of what I had or the picture that I was trying to build, although we did that over many months. And some of these concepts or these conceptual buckets were essentially, we took information sources that were considered relevant, and then we took data excerpts essentially from those and put them into these buckets that we had just come up with these headings. And some of these headings actually then went on to become final program theory names. So for example, you can see the role of regulatory and legislative frameworks under leadership and governance was the name of a program theory, and other ones didn't and actually didn't go further. So socialization of patients is an example. Longitudinal offering of shared decision making was something that we didn't judge had sufficient evidence at this time to go into a program theory, or in some cases we flattened these down and then combine them into one program theory, all the data sources and those underlying constructs. But actually breaking it up initially was very helpful to do this. I found this earlier today and I put it in just to show the amount of iterations that we went through to do this. This isn't even all of them, but it shows for anyone perhaps who is struggling or finding it really difficult. I remember at the time feeling like, and I had done a systematic review and meta-analysis before and a qualitative research package, feeling like, gosh, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. How am I going to do this? How am I going to present this in a coherent way? This is really overwhelming. And now actually, when I look at the papers, being really proud of what we've put together and the coherent story that I hope that they tell. But actually, just again, this slide is to give people hopefully some reassurance, or to explain that the messiness of it is normal, of those completed iterations over and over again is very normal, and actually to get down to that final product and to get to the quality that you need to in order to get your meaningful outputs. Another way that we helped with kind of focusing individual data sources, so aside from that individual assignment of quality ratings, was actually to think about the quality of the final program theory. And if we were going to add in any further data sources, and when we were going to actually stop searching, because that was important. There were some program theories that we didn't take forward, and that collectively, and Joe and I would have done a lot of work together on that to see, and Joe would have really, I suppose, tested me in that context in terms of asking, is this an evidence-based context mechanism outcome configuration, or is this an evidence-based program theory? Do we have sufficient evidence to take this statement forward? And thinking about then, okay, if I didn't, whether or not I needed to go and get more data, or whether or not my program theory as a whole was of sufficient quality to contribute something meaningful and to make a meaningful contribution to this area. But thinking about the quality of that program theory and having a framework actually for assessing quality was really important for knowing when to stop, because that's important too, because as we've said, these things can grow legs. So this framework that I've outlined here, people may be aware of it, but it comes from Jeff Wong's training in Realist methods, and it's called, I think, the inference to best explanation model. And essentially it's thinking about, yes, the trustworthiness of the individual data sources, but also the coherence overall of a program theory. So coherence in realist terms refers to how logical and consistent that argument is. So the highest quality program theory is plausible because it's supported by coherent arguments that are based on trustworthy data. So this is something, or a kind of framework, that we would have considered also in terms of thinking about the quality of our final program theory. And for people who are doing kind of PhD viva, is something I would have been asked about a lot as well in that context. So using the inference to best explanation model, coherence of arguments is judged through consideration of these three criteria. The first being consilience, or explanatory breadth, and that's the ability of your theory to explain as much of the data as you have. Simplicity, so that it's a theory that's simple and doesn't have to have all these if, buts, ands, or special assumptions made to it, and that it's essentially parsimonious as possible, or as parsimonious as possible. And finally, analogy, and that's really where your formal or substantive theory comes in. It fits with what we already know, and in this case that made sense, or it makes sense why we use that combi model of behavior to explain, or to use that theory to say, does this make sense, or does it fit with what we already know in terms of what we're finding out from our data analysis. So from our 72 data sources that we rated as 4 and 5 stars, i.e. worthy to inform our program theories, we came up with 10 different program theories. And each program theory outlined the impact of a major context on the engagement of clinicians in a key behavior, or one or more key behaviors of shared decision making. And in some cases, particularly the last 3 here, and mainly the last 3, the influence of different intervention strategies on modifying the influence of behaviors. So we obviously had a lot of results, and we needed to find a way to group these together in a coherent way to tell a story. And the way we did that is we took from this kind of macro, meso, micro level framework, which is used in the context of other implementation science methodologies, but fit really well actually with the structure of our program theories and the context in which they address. So the framework essentially gives a way of presenting results according to the level within a system at which they operate in. So for example, macro factors were those that operated at an institutional or societal level and were beyond the influence of individual organizations, but still have an influence on their behavior. Meso-level factors were local organizational influences that typically characterize or define the parameters of service delivery. And then those micro-level factors were attributes or characteristics of individual practitioners and their practice environments that shape prescribing behaviors. Another way that you could think of it, or could divide them up, was just put here with this kind of minus and positive. Essentially, the first 5 program theories that operated at that macro level were seen actually as contexts which serve to systematically decrease prescriber engagement in shared decision making. That's in contrast to the last 5, or the second set of 5 program theories, so program theory 6 to 10, which actually functioned to, or we found sufficient evidence that they functioned to systematically increase prescriber engagement in one or more of those key behaviors of shared decision-making interventions, and in the context of microfactors where these local shared decision-making interventions serve to operate in. So using this framework was a nice way actually to clearly communicate the different levels of operation of our program theories in the different contexts that we were talking about, and the resultant influence on prescriber behaviors, and spread them neatly actually between two publications too, and a way that kind of intuitively made sense to me. And it was really useful when I was trying to break them up so that I could clearly delineate between where these different program theories fit and communicate that clearly as well at the point of publication. So we did a lot of work to put our program theories together. After we had grouped them together, how we were actually going to display them in a way that was, again, intuitively interpretable to the range of different stakeholders that we were looking at. So as I said, we wanted to influence patients, but particularly clinicians, people who are responsible as well for the design and the delivery of mental health services, that was really important to be able to communicate our complex results on a complex topic coherently and in a way that was easily understood. So as I said, in program theories 1 to 5, we displayed macro level contexts and we presented these together. What we also did, so that immediately when you actually looked at these context, mechanism, outcome configurations, so each one of these displays a program theory. So this is actually program theory 1, program theory 2, program theory 3, program theory 4, and program theory 5. So sorry, I'm realizing I'm doing it on my own presentation version, but I'm not doing it on the screen behind. So the biomedical model of health predominating clinician training and socialization is program theory 1. And then it goes round in a clockwise way until you get to cultural and social norms that are predominant among clinicians is program theory 5. So we had flattened down our evidence into all of these 5 program theories. But we added this additional framework, which looked at outlining, again, contextual factors where these program theories fit, essentially. So whether or not they were relevant to people involved in leadership and governance, to service delivery, and to workforce. And that was important because we wanted to show the levels at which these program theories operate very quickly to those people who are responsible actually for addressing these. So program theories 1 to 5 all outline structure and contextual factors, as I said, that serve to decrease clinician engagement in key behaviors of shared decision making. So if I can give an example here, for example, let's say the 2 under this wider heading of leadership and governance, which are institutional and organizational cultures of risk aversion, and a second context, which is prioritization on harm reduction within mental health. So inadvertently, both of these contexts can actually reduce prescriber engagement with patient preferences and positive risk taking, both of which are key behaviors for a prescriber to demonstrate shared decision making. And they do this through creating fear, and that's fear of them not being trusted, fear of them being individually blamed, and fear of exposure to legislation or to liability also. So by clearly outlining that this is a leadership and governance factor that needs to be developed, actually we're communicating one of the key outcomes across all these program theories from the first part of the result is that in order to actually, or in order, I suppose, even for empirically supported shared decision-making interventions will be difficult to implement at scale within the real world settings. And that is due to the misalignment, as you can see in these 5 program theories, between the complex cultural, the legal, the political, and the professional realities which are prominent within these settings. So actually for widespread prescriber uptake of behaviors required of shared decision-making, it's structural interventions that we need. So things that look at actually how do we decrease that fear, for example, among prescribers? How do we increase their psychological safety when it comes to making decisions around antipsychotic treatment and providing care to people with psychosis? And this is very much in contrast to a lot of the interventional research that you see that focuses on providing patients with information in different formats, for example, within consultations. But actually, as you can see clearly, hopefully from these 5 program theories here, a lot of the things that need to be addressed at this macro level in order to systematically increase prescriber engagement are way beyond that. And that was something when we were thinking about this framework of how we were going to communicate these results that we wanted to make that clear, hence why we added in these kind of overarching headings too on top of that macro level context. So I hope that makes some sense. In the second part, these were the micro and the meso level factors. And as I said, in contrast to the first 5 program theories where we found evidence of these structural and contextual factors serving to systematically decrease prescriber engagement in shared decision making, these functioned actually to increase prescriber engagement in shared decision making where they were implemented in the right context. So again, those structural and contextual factors had to be in place, but we did identify pockets of good practice, and we were trying to make explicit there what is it about those pockets actually that functions to increase prescriber engagement, again in these key sorts of behaviors, as you can see here in the orange, which is engagement in positive risk taking, engagement with patient preferences, and increased sharing of decision making responsibility. And essentially what we found, and again, we use the same kind of labels for framework in the first three here, is that these are three contextual factors within shared decision-making interventions, essentially the intervention strategy, that we did find supportive empirical and theoretical research that they can function to increase prescriber engagement with patient treatment preferences and with positive risk-taking. And it's these that we could find evidence for, these three intervention strategies that should be the focus of scale-up, actually, of interventions in the context of shared decision making, or that we have intervention or sufficient evidence for, actually, that are evidence-based intervention strategies. And that's attempting shared decision making in the context of trusting patient prescriber relationships. So where you have that longitudinal relationship with the person, I feel as a prescriber more psychologically safe to increase your confidence or to increase your autonomy within decision making. Prescribers also feel safer in established teams making decisions where there is that reduced fear of sole responsibility. And we also found tailored training for prescribers alongside continued supervision can be helpful to increase their confidence that actually shared decision making can be appropriately implemented among people who are experiencing psychotic symptoms. In contrast, actually, to a lot of the research in this area, we couldn't find sufficient empirical or theoretical research to support decision aids in their current form or sole patient training, but we did include those as program theory 9 and 10 to say, actually, from a theoretical perspective, what would be likely to be helpful to increase prescriber engagement with these tools. And that's combined patient and prescriber training and co-produced decision aids too, so that prescribers felt that they could trust the information sources that they were being expected to implement within their consultations, and also that they had the autonomy to decide when it was appropriate to use them. So as you can appreciate, psychosis exists on a spectrum, and some people are sufficiently too unwell to engage in any aspect of decision making when they're first admitted to services, but that changes over time, and some people can admit more kind of mildly to moderately unwell and do have the capacity to engage in different aspects of treatment decisions as well. But prescribers need to feel that they have autonomy over that in order to engage with those tools and not just disregard them as inappropriate for their services. So within these final program theories here, 9 and 10, we suggested changes that actually would be needed to likely increase prescriber engagement in these behaviors. So hopefully that makes sense. Really what we were trying to do here is to highlight across program theories 7, 8, and 9 that these are the contextual factors or the intervention strategies that there is an evidence base for that increase prescriber engagement, and in the second ones, what you would need to do to change them to increase their engagement. Also, by making these mechanisms explicit for the outcomes that we want, these are really useful for researchers who want to actually go and design novel shared decision-making interventions to say, what would I need to, or what intervention strategies would I need to incorporate to address these types of mechanisms which are responsible, or trigger these types of mechanisms which are responsible for the behaviors that I want. And that was a really useful part of that second part of our review in terms of increasing engagement or increasing involvement of researchers too, not just clinicians and policymakers. And finally, we put this in our second paper, and this was very much around how we were going to bring, or this was made for the purposes of how we were going to bring program theories 1 to 10 together in a way that someone could read and hopefully would find interesting, and again, still convey the complexity of our results and the importance of them, but in a way that actually was interpretable too, due to the volume and, as I said, the complexity of them. So we kind of divided it up into structural factors, which, as I said, those macro factors, and intervention strategies, which were these micro or meso factors. But essentially, we thought that this was a really useful way of putting in these contexts around here, focusing this on prescriber behaviors and actually communicating these mechanisms clearly in the circle, which have an impact on prescriber behaviors in the context of shared decision making. This slide will only really be of interest for those who are working in psychiatry or who are particularly interested in the area. But really, I suppose the point I wanted to make here was the importance of effectively communicating complex results and spending time. We did spend a lot of time making our 2 previous diagrams in terms of program theories I actually got a graphic designer to help me with making them because it was something I thought was really important. And when I have read other people's program theories, and they were made up of a lot of these words, I suppose, obviously it takes up a lot of space, but I just found it too difficult to comprehend. So something I found really useful was actually spending a lot of time on images and diagrams, thinking how I'm going to effectively communicate these results, as well as it being helpful for the purposes of saving space when it comes to presentations or journals, but actually thinking about how to effectively communicate your results is really, really important, particularly when it is something that is a more novel methodology too. So with that in mind, I will stop speaking. As I said, I hope that was useful for people. It's something that I find complex to talk about because it's still new for me. So hopefully it is useful, or was useful. As I said, I'm more than happy if people want to ask any questions now or to get in contact. I might put my email in the chat there. If people want to ask questions about their review, particularly if, like me, you were a novice realist researcher and I can help, or help with resources or things that I use that we didn't discuss in the slides today, I'm more than happy to do that. As I said, in multiple channels, working with Joe was invaluable in terms of I had done the formal training with Oxford, which was really, really helpful. And I still go back to a lot of the notes, but actually having a methodologist to work alongside, even just to reassure me that I was on the right track. As someone who had been trained in purely positivist research methods, I hadn't even thought about that there was any different sorts of research paradigms or implementation science methodologies. It was so helpful to have someone just to give me a bit of confidence that I was on the right track, to talk me through things, to challenge me as well when I was bringing through my own experience as a clinician working in this area and my own bias, to make sure that when we got to the point of sharing our results, that I was, especially because lots of them were contentious in terms of talking about the impact of mental health legislation or powerful structures that exist in psychiatry, that I was confident in doing that, actually having a methodologist to help me through the process, so that I was so clear that everything I was saying or making statements for was evidence-based, was so, so important. But if people want to get in touch, please do email me if I could help with the kind of practical pieces rather than the methodological pieces. Or we hang out on LinkedIn as well all the time, me and Joe. So please do get in touch. But with that, I'll stop sharing, and hopefully that was of interest. I'll turn back on.
Oh, Ita, that's like a trip down memory lane. Take a breath, just take a moment, have a drink of water.
Yeah.
I do think that you did try and get across some of the complexity and some of the messiness, but I don't think anything can ever really get across some of the messiness. No. And like when you said that document over PTSD, crikey, I don't know how many times we reviewed that document together. So yeah, I used to sit in the back of our motorhome as we're traveling from campsite to campsite, typing feedback.
Yeah, I remember.
Sending it off. We're driving here today, and then so I do the next on the next sort of on the next trip. So what I'd like to do in true realist hub style is, if we can, and I have worked out now how to do those virtual clapping hands. I worked that out a couple of weeks ago. I felt very proud of myself because each time I do this, think, God, I need to work that out, and then forget. So I'm going to do proper clapping. So those of you that feel so enamored, you can do proper clapping, and those of you who feel technologically advanced, you can do the visual clapping. But thank you very much, Ita. It's been really interesting to see that like laid out in that like journey, laid out so beautifully. it was a lot of back and forth in the process. So if anyone has any questions about any of the things that you just presented, pop them in the chat and we will come to you in turn. But I think one of the things I really enjoyed was the visuals at the end. You know, I remember when you presented those to us and I was like, wow, okay, that is awesome. We'd already worked out that they fitted under these broad structural headings, and we'd already worked that out, but actually seeing it come together in a visual, I think does make a massive difference. I'm not a visually productive person, so I do admire people that can see things like that. Who is it who's good with visuals? There's somebody, is it who did the messy swamp? Becky, Rebecca.
Oh,
someone did something about the swamp. Who's that?
Oh,
does anyone know? Oh, I'll have to go and look that up in a second. There's something about realist research and the swamp. Being stuck in the swamp is what I remember, and they're really, really good with visuals, and I've seen posters of their work as well. It's working in mental health as well, I think, which is why I probably gravitate to it.
Yeah, it was well worth the time. Like I remember just thinking, okay, how am I going to get this across in a coherent way? And doing that. Someone I think has asked in the chat about um software that I used. I paid a graphic designer. So that flower piece comes from my own organization. They used it as a background, and I remember seeing them in a presentation and being like, oh, that's so useful for the context mechanism outcome piece. I sent it to a graphic designer and said, can you make this as a template for me? So I don't know what I'd say it was probably Adobe Design. I don't think it was expensive to get them to do it for me. If you go on to Fiverr, for example, loads of people do those things. It's important to know what you are and what you're not. And I'm not a graphic designer. So sometimes I use Canva for things, which Joe, I think you use too, is just helpful. But I actually just asked someone to make it for me. I had the image in my head of what I wanted to look like, and I paid someone, is the blunt answer.
Yeah,
To do
I couldn't have even like got, yeah, I'm not even sure I could have had the image in my head. Right, okay, so I'm just trying to scroll down to see the questions. It looks like Claire Hannah Russell is the first proper question.
Okay.
And it's how far do you think the Cochrane collaboration have to go on embracing the methods that we developed through quality assessment, data extraction, and so on? Gosh, Cochrane, go on, go for it.
Yeah, I'll make some enemies there now, that one. Do you know what? I, if I've understood your question correctly, I think it like in this particular area, to use that style, which is, I suppose, hopefully the argument we put forward, to use that methodology doesn't make sense to answer the questions that we wanted to answer. I think viewing it all through the lens of we can address it with these positivist research paradigms, they're so useful for certain things. Like I'm a pharmacist, I use Cochrane Review all the time to understand the average efficacy estimates of drugs or side effects. And that makes sense. But when you're studying a behavior change intervention, that does not make sense to flatten it down into these average efficacy estimates. And you're almost guaranteeing the non-specific results that we have when we study these interventions through that lens. I think the problem is a lot of the time our training, like as I said, I remember coming to this thinking, okay, well, we definitely need a new approach and thinking about how we would study these interventions, but you're not introduced to it in a systematic way through your training as a clinician. And because we rely on Cochrane or that evidence pyramid in terms of Cochrane reviews being the gold standard, as clinicians who are working as researchers, you don't even have a frame of reference to think about that there are alternatives,
No.
if that makes sense. So I think it's getting a little bit better, but it was something that, as I said, I had to try. And I remember, if you remember, Joe, doing that cover letter to journals 55 times to try because we wanted to pitch it as a two-part review because it was so huge. We probably could have done 3 parts.
Yeah, and we did have discussions about dropping data as well. We had big
Yeah,
discussions about literally dropping huge bits of the data to try and
yeah,
fit it into one publication.
yeah. But I remember having to think or get my head around so clearly how this was going to be used as an adjunct or something that was helpful in addition to Cochrane style reviews and not pitch it as an either or. And for me, that makes sense also when I'm just trying to think about what is the nature of the phenomenon within that research question that I'm trying to address. And for me, I suppose that's pragmatism, isn't it, with regards to realist paradigms using or research paradigms using the methodology that makes most sense to answer the research question that you want. So if it is, how well does a drug work for the average bear? A Cochrane review is wonderful. If it is, when do these types of interventions work if I want to induce behavior change among other people? That doesn't tell me anything valuable. Does that make sense, or do you think that answers
I think it does, and I'm
the
going to add to that
question?
because my PhD was founded on a Cochrane review. So
Oh,
the first piece of evidence I had was the Cochrane review, which highlighted that they don't really know how and why this works. That was actually highlighted through it. But what I actually found really helpful was I went and found every study that was included in the Cochrane review and individually reviewed every study. And lo and behold, in some of the discussion sections were some things that you would, call your realist gold, where the researchers were sort of hypothesizing on why they thought things may or may not have worked in certain circumstances. That
okay.
evidence obviously didn't make the Cochrane review, but the Cochrane review had collated all of the randomized control trials together, which allowed me then that starting point, and that's how I branched out and did the rest of my PhD. So I do agree with you, Rita, they have their place for particular
Yeah.
things. And as I discovered, they can even be useful even when you don't think they will be.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's move on to the next question. So Laurie wanted to know what software you use, but I think you said you got a graphic designer to do that, so that's probably professional.
Yeah.
There's lots of love in the chat. So Michael Norton's next. Michael is currently in the process of data extraction and was wondering how you narrow down IPTs, as you've done one paper so far and have 5 IPTs.
Oh, well, hi, Michael. I think you're a fellow Irish person, if I've got that correct. So you're welcome. It's lovely to see people at this side of the pond too, as well as the other side. I'm trying to think that far back. To be honest, I think and Joe, you can correct me on this, or you might know more from working in other reviews or having much more experience than me with this. We only had one initial program theory. Like
I
the
think
10
we
program
probably
theories came
approached
at
it
the
differently,
end.
Ita. So we didn't develop program theories till the end. We developed concepts. We had conceptual buckets of things we thought were relevant, and then they were consolidated into, I think eventually you had 11 that went down to 10, because I think we didn't have enough evidence for 11. So I think you could, if you looked at every paper, as Michael has probably done, one paper, develop several IPTs from that paper, and then you go to another one, and then before you know it, you've got 384 IPTs. I take a different approach to that because I don't have that much time to develop all of those and then work out where the crossover, which is what we worked with, which was to what's the broad concept about this piece of evidence, and then we looked at synthesizing. So IPT development and CMOC development comes, the approach that I take, much later, much later. It allows you to sit with the data more rather than get stuck around the realist terminology. You can sit with the data in that way and then phrase the realist bits towards the end.
Yeah, that actually is very true as well. And I think I remember from training and from learning from you in terms of feeling like stuck on that initial program theory piece initially, that this should look like a CMOC, or doesn't look anything like a program theory that I've seen in X, Y, and Z journals, rather than actually being like, I just need to try and get a map of how I get to this outcome at the end, broadly what I think of, and then just go and search for literature, make those buckets, and come back around and do it in that iterative way, rather than getting stuck on this initial thing should look like the final thing, because in our case, it looks so different anyways. So actually trying to move to the data extraction and just not focusing on it looking like a program theory was very helpful, or those conceptual buckets were really important.
I think at the end of the day, if you just remember, a program theory is an explanation. It's an explanation of how that context and that mechanism come together to form the outcome at a broad level.
Yeah.
So it's an overarching explanation of how something works, and it's a stab in the sand. It's not going to be the final thing. And I spent far too long developing my IPT for my PhD. One of the pieces of advice I do routinely try and offer people is get it in early, do some reading, do some literature, and have do some PowerPoints. What's going on here? What's the literature telling you? What's the gaps? And develop your IPT from there. But don't spend months and months and months and months and months doing one, because you don't move forward. As you said, you can get very frustrated with how long it takes anyway.
Yeah. I'm actually sorry to interrupt Joe before I move on, just because people are going to put my email in the chat. If people have asked for copies of things that I presented here, but that I didn't publish anywhere, if people want them, they can just get in touch.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one. This is about publishing the protocol. So how did you find publishing the review after we published the protocol? This will be interesting because we had quite a few protocol deviations. And what are the strategies to help with this? Got backstory. They're worried about boxing themselves in by writing a protocol and being able to manage and justify changes to the research team, given the iterative nature of realist work. So my top tip before Eva says hers is don't get yourself narrowed down too specifically in the protocol. Keep the protocol broad enough, because you have to justify all the changes you make. But Ita, you did that quite well. You uploaded a separate document.
Well, I did that quite well because of your advice. So I remember at the time being like, because again, I was just after coming off the back of doing a systematic review and meta-analysis, being like, but I need to clearly outline what outcome I'm going to be studying, what outcome I'm going to be looking at. What do you mean? Or like the population group that could change. So keeping it broad was important. Keeping a track of all my changes so that I could make it clear why I made any changes was very important too. But I think that's the key to success. Keeping it broad enough, citing other protocols too, so that you're making the point very early that this is a completely different research methodology. It's not the same as a systematic review or a Cochrane review. And I think we probably were lucky that with the editor of Schizophrenia Bulletin, they were interested in the topic, they thought it was important, they wanted to move forward, and got that it was, and the people who reviewed our work, which is maybe something that's important as well when you're liaising with journals and things like that, that you're asking for peer reviewers that actually are experienced in realist methodology so that they understand that those deviations from protocols are very much standard in the context of this type of evidence synthesis compared to a Cochrane style review where you will be asked to explicitly explain all of those protocol deviations in a supplementary appendix or something like that. But that's probably what I would say is, I think it was helpful for us, you, Joe, liaising with editors and trying to make sure that we got a journal that respected our work, I think is probably it, or not expected it to fit in to a traditional systematic review style protocol, that kind of way, and got what we were trying to do and why it was different. And we were lucky with peer review too, in terms of, I think, maybe we had to suggest people, we probably did, or maybe just suggested them off the bat to review the protocol and the final paper. So again, we weren't getting people who expected it to look like a Cochrane review.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've noticed as well is sometimes you get reviewers that get realist methods and sometimes you don't. So there is an element of then replying and rebutting the comment from the reviewer and letting them know this is in line with realist methods. And then I also, when I do that through replying to editors, is I'll put in a reference to other published material to let them know. I'll either put the explicit link into Ramsey standards or I'll put something else in to let them know that the approach that we've taken is completely normal. But I hope that helps to answer that question, Katharina. If not, something else. So we've got the next one is Jeff Meyer says, interested to see how you, for example, tailored prescriber training as context versus an intervention resource that is part of the mechanism.
So I suppose context is any feature of the circumstance which is functioning to influence the prescriber's behavior. It wasn't the mechanism which was responsible for the behavior, and we did not use, even though I initially looked at it when I was kind of trying to flesh out this, I think it's Sonia Dalkin's method, is it, Joe, that divides it up into mechanism, resource, and response. So the mechanism is that response to the intervention strategy that leads to the outcome, rather than it being any, it modifies the context rather than it being the mechanism, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Joe, maybe you can.
Well, all I want to say is that you don't have to use the Sonia Dalkin method. I've used both. And I work with people who use one or the other. Sometimes the method of splitting, so it would potentially work in this scenario, but actually the resource component works really, really well when you've got a pre and a post intervention, because then you've got a pre scenario, you've got a post scenario, you know what your intervention looks like. You've done what I like to call like a giant slice at life or a diagnostic type review, which is you're looking at the landscape. And therefore, the intervention would change to what you could parcel up as the intervention would change depending on your analytical focus as you go through it. So I think that is also a choice and something that people do have to bear in mind. I'm conscious of time, and I know this is like a really complex thing. We could probably spend an hour just talking about mechanisms, but I hope, Jeff, that's given some insight into that. So the next one we've got is Yvonne, which says, you talked about determining whether your outputs were CMOCs or program theories. How were you differentiating between the two, and is there overlap?
God, that's a question I'm probably going to struggle with without actually moving through an example of the process.
I think it's about the level of evidence, wasn't it? And then grouping the evidence, because the program theories came last.
Yeah.
The CMOCs came first. The heading for the program theory was there quite early on, because that was part of the framework that you used to do it. The CMOCs came from the data first, and there was like loose ideas about what the program theories are going to be. They evolved based on on CMOCs.
Because we had, and actually, do you know what might be helpful? If you look at our papers, we published as a supplementary appendix our 23 final CMOCs and then our 10 program theories. So it might be more helpful for you if you look at that supplementary appendix, because it might be more informative as to how we actually ended up flattening them down, because when you read them, you should hopefully be able to see how they grouped together and how we were able to blend that into 10 program theories. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I think so, because also all the evidence is there. So the program theory is there, the CMOC's there, and every piece of evidence that informed that program theory or CMOC is also there. So I think
that
that
is
should
actually
help.
very true. Yeah, our whole data analysis documents are there. So that
so
might
someone else can go and do it and see what they come up with.
Yeah, enjoy. I think it's about 250 pages long. But if that doesn't answer, feel free to get in touch. But do have a look at that. That might answer your question better than me kind of waffling on now, if that makes sense. Hopefully that's okay.
So Claire Hannah Russell has said she'd like to see I don't know what the CC support guidance, I don't know what the CC means, and the template example. For example, the STAR system, I developed that in a previous project just because I was struggling to keep track of the data. And you can adapt this. So I imagine the way that I used it is a little bit different to the way that Ita used it, but I had a 1, which meant that I didn't think it was very relevant. 2, which meant I'm not very sure about this. I want to come back to it. 3 stars were no, perhaps 2, I can't remember. Anyway, 4 stars were 3 stars were good, useful information potentially for my introduction and background, because I'd moved from stroke over into mental health and I needed some good information for me to be able to learn more about the topics. 4 were like good, and 5 were really, really, top qualities. And again, we chose the 4 and 5 stars to progress into our review. I then went back and reappraised all the 2 stars. They all made it to 1 stars. And then the 3 stars were then used to help formulate my introduction and discussion and of the subsequent literature. I've worked with other people who've taken that star system and adapted it slightly to their own needs. So it was just a way for me to deal with the volumes of data and to try and pragmatically focus the number of papers, because like you two, we had well over 100, into something that was more manageable.
Yeah, it was key, and I remember being asked loads about it in my Viva, that system. I was like, well, you need to ask Joe.
I've been asked to write a paper on it, and I'm like, oh, it's just giving them a number. To me, I can't see the value in it, but I do get asked quite a lot about it. No. So Yvonne's from Galway, and she says it's reassuring that there have been changes between the protocol and the review. Always, Yvonne, always. But I think that's also the nature of a realist review. And you can head that off at the pass at the beginning of the methods section and say, it is common to experience protocol deviations within a realist review. Ours are, you included a whole supplemental file on your protocol deviation, so you could do something similar.
Yeah. And to get ahead of it when you anticipate that it might be an issue, sometimes that's helpful, even just for reassurance around yourself, that kind of way.
Yeah. Oh, so the CC was the Cochrane collaboration. Let me go back to that. Yeah, okay. I get where you're going now. Thank you. Please, could you come again with the use of stars? Okay, I didn't realize stars are going to be the theme of today. So in the Realist review, we chose to rank the papers with a star system. We had too many papers, and we had you could almost call it a rapid review, but I haven't called it a rapid review. We had a very focused time period in which to continue the review. So I read all of the full texts and assigned them a star. 5 stars were awesome papers. And in fact, one of my colleagues came back and had 5+ stars. So they call them the princes. So they were like 5+ stars. But we had 5 stars and 4 stars. So the 5 stars were very, very rich, very relevant, and very, we thought were very rigorous. A lot of the qualitative papers were in the 5 stars. 4 stars were still excellent, but just less so. 3 stars potentially tangentially linked to the research question, but not really relevant. So they might have had more about the randomized control trials. They might have had more in about the background of the area. 2 was, I really don't know, and I need to make a decision, and I haven't got 3 hours to read one paper 84 times and to work this out. So I assigned it 2 and came back to it. And 1 was, yeah, no, I don't think that's relevant anymore. I'm reading the full text. That's how I did it. How did you do it, Ita? Can you remember?
I did it in a similar way. I think I have outlined it a little bit more in our paper. So I think I had asked you, Joe, for a bit more information on assessing quality. So if you look at the papers, it's there. If it's not there, it's in my PhD Viva, so you can email me and I can send you that chapter. Because somewhere I had expanded on it based on either peer reviewers or in my minor edits being asked to expand on it. So you had given me something, Joe, to do that as to how we assessed the quality of them. Someone else also asked about whether or not we used an appraisal template during that. I'm trying to think, did I use an appraisal template? I don't think so, but I had made, we did the assessments in duplicate. So two other independent members of the research team looked at, so I had given it a 3 to 4 or 5, etc. And someone else did it in duplicate with all those 72 documents that we included to add an element of rigor around it. So again, it wasn't just a subjective process. So yes, either have a look at the papers and see if it's there, and that will have, will be Joe's method added on to with a little bit more context, or email me and I can send you my PhD chapter that outlines it. Sorry,
I think in our paper it's only like 2 lines as well. I don't think it's very.
Someone asked me to add on to it in some context, and I went through it in more detail and asked you. So it is outlined in one of those places. So have a look, and if you can't find it, send me an email and I'll send on whatever it is that's needed.
Well, I think we have answered all the questions. If we haven't, please speak up now, forever hold your peace, because it's just been missed, and that's just an oversight. So apologies for that. As usual, I will hang on this chat for a little bit if anyone has any burning questions, concerns, or anything they want to ask. Just to let people know, I will try and stop the recording in a moment, but that bit will not be recorded. So if anyone has anything that they don't wish the whole world to know about because they're feeling a little bit vulnerable, that's okay. We can be vulnerable together. So once again, Ita, thanks very much. It's lovely to see it. I mean, I was so proud when it came out. Like, wow.
Yeah, I know.
I have loved the project, but then again, I do love all my realist projects. But this one's particularly special, I think, because of the massive crossover in our particular interests as well. And it's been lovely to work with. And I have to say that although you kind of said Joe did this, Joe did that, the level of work is down to the input that you put in, and that you couldn't get that. And the amount of time I said to you, Ita, we really need to think about chopping some of this because of the volume, and you were like, no, I'm going to make it work. And and that's testament to you. So we did have lots of discussions about, we need to reduce this, it's too big. So
yeah, well, listen, we make a good team, so teamwork makes the dream work.